Carl Brennan had been farming 800 acres in Finney County, Kansas since 1993. He was 57 years old, and he had run John Deere equipment for 30 years, buying his first machine from Garrett Equipment in Garden City when he was 27 years old, and adding to the fleet steadily as the operation grew. He had bought 9 tractors from Garrett Equipment over 3 decades. He had bought 2 combines. He had bought planters and tillage equipment and precision agriculture upgrades and parts and filters and hydraulic fluid and every consumable item a working farm required in sufficient quantity that he was one of the dealership's most consistent accounts. The owner of Garrett Equipment was a man named Garrett Holloway, the second generation of the family that had founded the dealership in 1971, and Carl had done business with Garrett personally since Garrett had taken over from his father in 2004. They were not close friends. They were not the kind of men who called each other for reasons unrelated to equipment. But they had a professional relationship built on 30 years of transactions, and Carl had always considered it a relationship he could count on when something went wrong, which in farming was when relationships mattered most. The warranty dispute had been over a 2019 John Deere 8R.340. Carl had bought it new in the spring of 2019 for $384,000. It was the most expensive single piece of equipment he had ever purchased, and he had maintained it with a care that reflected that investment. He kept the service records in a dedicated binder organized by date and service type. He used the fluids specified in the operator's manual. He met every scheduled maintenance interval without exception. At 3,200 hours, the hydraulic pump had failed. Carl had brought the machine to Garrett Equipment, and the service manager had run diagnostics and confirmed the failure. Carl had submitted the warranty claim. 2 weeks later, the claim had come back, denied. John Deere Corporate said the hydraulic fluid Carl had used in one service interval in 2021 was a cross-brand equivalent rather than the branded John Deere fluid specified in the manual. The deviation was documented in Carl's own service records because Carl documented everything. The deviation was minor. The fluid met all technical specifications. The fluid's manufacturer provided documentation confirming compatibility with John Deere hydraulic systems. None of it mattered to the warranty department. The claim was denied. The repair estimate was $51,000. Carl had called Garrett Holloway directly. He had explained the situation. He had offered to provide the fluid compatibility documentation. Garrett had said he would look into it. 2 days later, Garrett had called back and said the dealership had reviewed the claim and supported corporate's position. Carl had asked Garrett if he was going to advocate for a customer who had bought 9 tractors from his dealership over 30 years. Garrett had said the warranty terms were clear and the dealership could not override corporate's determination. Carl had asked if Garrett personally believed the hydraulic fluid deviation had caused the pump failure. Garrett had said it was not his place to second-guess the engineering assessment. Carl had said he understood. He had thanked Garrett for his time. He had hung up and paid the $51,000 repair bill from his operating account, which reduced his cushion for the planting season to a level that made him uncomfortable. He did not call Garrett again. He spent 4 months researching. He was not impulsive. He was the kind of man who made large decisions slowly and implemented them decisively, and the decision he was moving toward was as large as any he had made in 30 years of farming. He contacted 6 Massey Ferguson operators in Kansas and Colorado and asked each of them for an honest assessment of their experience with the equipment and the dealer network. He visited the Massey Ferguson dealer in Dodge City, a man named Doug Patterson, who had been in business for 14 years. He spent 2 days at Doug's dealership asking questions about service capability, parts availability, technician response times for field breakdowns, and warranty claim outcomes over the past 3 years. He drove 3 Massey Ferguson machines, including the 8S Tank 265, which was the nearest equivalent to his primary John Deere. He came back to Finney County with enough information to make a decision. In February 2022, Carl traded his 3 primary John Deere tractors at Garrett Equipment, which was the cleanest way to close the relationship since Garrett's machines needed to go somewhere, and there was no reason to sell them privately when Garrett would take them as trades. The transactions were professional and unremarkable. Carl gave Garrett no explanation for the trades, beyond saying he was changing his fleet configuration. He bought a Massey Ferguson 8S265, a 7S at 210, and a 6S 155 from Doug Patterson's dealership in Dodge City. He drove home and parked them in his machine shed, and the following Monday he used them for spring field work. The comment that changed everything happened at the Garden City Farm Show in April 2022. Carl had gone to the show as he did every year, walking the equipment displays, talking to agronomists and input suppliers and other farmers. He had run into Garrett Holloway at the Garrett Equipment booth, a booth that occupied a prominent corner position because Garrett's family had been sponsoring the show for 40 years. They had exchanged professional pleasantries. Then, within Carl's earshot, Garrett had turned to a neighboring exhibitor and made a comment that Carl heard clearly and that Garrett appeared not to realize Carl had heard. Garrett had said that some farmers thought switching to Massey Ferguson was a real solution, but in this part of Kansas, there was no service infrastructure to support it, and they would find that out soon enough. He said the nearest authorized Massey Ferguson service was Dodge City, and when something broke at 2 a.m. during harvest, they would be on the phone to a dealer 50 miles away, and good luck with that. The neighboring exhibitor had laughed. Carl had walked away without responding. He had thought about what Garrett had said during the 40-minute drive back to his farm. He thought about it for several days, and then he started planning. Carl had been maintaining his own equipment since he was 19 years old. His father had run a repair shop in Garden City before the farming operation had grown large enough to require his full attention, and Carl had spent every summer of his teenage years in that shop learning to diagnose and repair mechanical systems. He had rebuilt transmission on John Deere machines. He had done complete engine overhauls. He had fabricated custom hydraulic line fittings when the correct part was not available in time for a critical repair. His shop was better equipped than most commercial service operations. He had a 32-ton press. He had a full electrical diagnostic suite. He had MIG and TIG welding capability. He had a lathe that had belonged to his father and that Carl still used regularly. He was not a hobby mechanic. He was a competent and experienced agricultural equipment technician who happened to also farm for a living. What he lacked was the manufacturer's diagnostic software and the formal certification that would allow him to represent himself as an authorized service provider. Garrett's comment had told him exactly what he needed to do about that. He spent the winter of 2022 to 2023 obtaining Massey Ferguson service certification. The process involved completing an online training program through AGCO's Technician Development Platform, which was the parent company's service training system, followed by a practical assessment at an authorized training facility in Wichita. Carl completed the online coursework in November and December, studying in the evenings after the farm's daily work was done, treating it with the same systematic attention he had given to the equipment research before switching brands. He drove to Wichita in January for the practical assessment. The assessment took 2 days. Carl passed it on the first attempt. The AGCO assessor noted in his evaluation that Carl's diagnostic approach was methodical and his mechanical execution was professional, and that his results were consistent with an experienced technician rather than someone new to the brand. Carl thanked him and drove home. He ordered the AGCO diagnostic laptop and software that he needed to interface with Massey Ferguson's electronic systems. He registered as an independent AGCO authorized service provider, a designation available to independent shops that met the certification and equipment requirements. He spent February building out his shop with the additional tooling that Massey Ferguson's service work required beyond what he already had. He built a second service bay to handle the additional capacity. He ordered an initial parts inventory covering the most common service items and wear components across the 3 machine families he planned to service. By March 2023, he was operational. He did not advertise immediately. He told 4 farmers he was friendly with that he was offering Massey Ferguson service at his shop at rates 40% below what the Dodge City dealer charged for comparable work. He told them he was fully certified and had the proper diagnostic equipment. He asked them to spread the word to anyone they knew running Massey Ferguson equipment in the region. Within 2 weeks, he had his first service customer, a farmer named Wallace from Gray County, who had a 7S 180 with a persistent telematics fault that Doug Patterson's dealership in Dodge City had looked at twice without resolving. Carl spent 4 hours with Wallace's machine. He identified a wiring harness fault that the previous diagnoses had missed because the previous technician had not followed the diagnostic tree completely. He repaired it and tested the repair through a full operational cycle and confirmed the fault was resolved. Wallace paid the service bill, which was 60% of what Patterson's shop would have charged, and told Carl he had been dealing with that fault for 8 months. Carl said he was glad to have solved it. Wallace told 2 other farmers. Those farmers told 2 more. By June 2023, 3 months after opening to service customers, Carl had worked on 11 different Massey Ferguson machines owned by 9 different farmers across Finney, Gray, and Haskell counties. Word traveled in the farming community the way it always did, through direct conversations at the co-op and the elevator and the feed store and the equipment shows. People talked about equipment problems and equipment solutions the way they talked about weather and prices. If someone had a good experience with a service provider, they said so. If someone had a bad experience, they also said so. Carl's service work was receiving good reports. He was thorough. He was fast by local standards. He communicated clearly about what he found and what he proposed to do about it and what it was going to cost before he did the work. He did not have surprises in his invoices. These qualities, which were the baseline of good service work, were apparently not universal in the regional service market, because multiple customers told Carl that what he was doing was better than what they had been getting elsewhere. Carl said he was just doing the work correctly. The customers said they knew, and it was still better than what they had been getting. In September 2023, 6 months after Carl began offering service, Doug Patterson in Dodge City called him. Patterson had heard about Carl's operation through a customer who had mentioned it casually. Patterson was not hostile. He was a professional who recognized a change in his market and wanted to understand it. He asked Carl what he was doing. Carl explained his certification and his setup and his rate structure. Patterson asked if Carl planned to expand. Carl said he was focused on providing good service to farmers in the immediate region, and he did not have expansion plans. Patterson said he appreciated the transparency. He said if Carl ever encountered a repair that exceeded his capacity, he should call Patterson and they could figure out a referral arrangement. Carl said he would do that. The call ended without tension. Carl respected Patterson for making it. It was the call of a man who understood competition and responded to it professionally rather than with hostility. Garrett Holloway's call was different. It came in October 2023. Garrett had heard about Carl's operation from a salesman who had come back from a call in Gray County and mentioned that 2 John Deere customers in the area were asking about switching to Massey Ferguson because there was now a local service operation. Garrett called Carl on a Tuesday morning. Carl was in the shop working on a hydraulic cylinder rebuild for a 6S 155 that belonged to a farmer named Terry in Haskell County. He answered the phone and set down his tools. Garrett said he had heard Carl was running some kind of service operation. Carl said he was offering Massey Ferguson service work at his farm shop. Garrett said he had heard Carl was undercutting the market on rates. Carl said he charged rates that reflected his cost structure and his assessment of the fair value of the service he provided. Garrett said the rates Carl was charging were below what it cost a properly operated dealership to provide service. Carl said his cost structure was different from a dealership's cost structure because he did not have a showroom or a sales staff or a floor plan, and he was not subsidizing those costs through service revenue. Garrett said Carl was creating unfair competition for established businesses. Carl said he thought that was an interesting framing from someone who had supported a $51,000 warranty denial on a hydraulic pump failure that a competent engineering analysis would not have attributed to a minor hydraulic fluid specification deviation. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Then he said that was a separate matter. Carl said he agreed it was a separate matter. He said he was happy to discuss the service competition question and the warranty question on their own merits at whatever depth Garrett wanted to go. Garrett said he had said what he needed to say. Carl said he understood. They ended the call. By the spring of 2024, Carl's service operation had worked on 23 distinct Massey Ferguson machines. He had 6 regular service accounts, farmers who brought their Massey Ferguson equipment to Carl for all scheduled maintenance, and who called him first when they had a breakdown. 3 of those 6 had previously been Garrett equipment customers before switching to Massey Ferguson. This was the part of the market dynamic that mattered most in concrete terms. Carl had not set out to take customers from Garrett equipment. He had set out to serve farmers who had Massey Ferguson equipment and needed capable local service. But the farmers who were best positioned to benefit from Carl's service operation were farmers who were considering switching from John Deere to Massey Ferguson and who had previously hesitated because they were concerned about the service infrastructure gap. Carl's shop addressed that gap directly. His existence as a local Massey Ferguson service provider removed one of the primary objections to switching brands in Finney County. He had not created that dynamic intentionally, but he had created it. In March 2024, Carl received a call from a farmer named Dennis, who farmed 1,200 acres in Finney County and who had been a Garrett equipment customer for 22 years. Dennis said he had been thinking about switching to Massey Ferguson and had heard about Carl's service operation. He said the service infrastructure question had been the main thing holding him back. He asked Carl directly whether Carl's operation was stable and whether he planned to continue operating it. Carl said yes to both. Dennis said he was going to come and look at the shop. He came the following week. He spent 3 hours at Carl's facility, looking at the diagnostic equipment, talking to Carl about his certification and his experience with the Massey Ferguson machines he had been servicing. He asked to see service records, which Carl provided with customer identifying information removed. Dennis asked what Carl's parts sourcing lead times were for non-inventory items. Carl showed him his ATCO parts account access and the system's lead time estimates for the most commonly needed parts. Dennis asked several more specific questions, and Carl answered each of them. Dennis said he was going to talk to Doug Patterson in Dodge City and then make a decision. Carl said he understood. Dennis called Patterson and then called Carl back 2 weeks later and said he was placing an order for a new Massey Ferguson 8S 265. He said he would be bringing it to Carl for all service work. He said Carl had been the deciding factor. Carl thanked him. He made a note in his service schedule for a new customer and went back to the hydraulic line replacement he had been doing when the phone rang. Dennis's order from Patterson's dealership in Dodge City represented one of the largest single transactions Patterson had done with a Finney County farmer in several years. Patterson called Carl after the sale was finalized. He said Dennis had told him that Carl's service operation had been the deciding factor in the switch. Patterson said he appreciated what Carl was doing for the brand's market position in the region. Carl said he was just offering good service. Patterson said good service in the right location changed the market. He said it was true in every industry. Carl agreed that it was true. Patterson asked if Carl would be interested in a more formal referral relationship, specifically if Patterson's shop could send overflow service work to Carl when Patterson was backed up, which happened regularly during harvest season. Carl said he would consider it. They discussed the parameters of what an overflow arrangement might look like. Carl said he would think about it and call Patterson back. He called back the following week and said yes. The overflow arrangement began in the summer of 2024. Patterson's shop sent 4 jobs to Carl between June and August, jobs that would otherwise have waited 3 weeks in Patterson's service queue. The farmers who received the faster service through Carl's shop were satisfied. Patterson was satisfied. Carl was satisfied. The arrangement made practical sense, independent of any other consideration. Garrett Equipment's service department completed a routine year in 2024. They serviced the same fleet of John Deere machines they had always serviced. They did not lose any of their existing John Deere customers to Carl's operation because Carl was not servicing John Deere equipment. But 3 of Garrett's customers who had been considering fleet changes over the past 2 years had made those changes in 2023 and 2024, and in each case, Carl's presence as a local Massey Ferguson service provider had been a factor in the timing and the decisiveness of the switch. Garrett was aware of this. Garrett's salesman had heard about it through the county's informal information network. Garrett had not called Carl again after the October 2023 conversation. Carl had not called Garrett. There was nothing either of them needed to say to the other. The situation had said what needed to be said more clearly than a conversation could have. Carl's shop serviced 31 distinct machines in 2024. He had expanded his parts inventory to cover the most common service items for 5 model families. He had hired a part-time assistant, a young man named Brandon, who was studying agricultural mechanics at a community college in Garden City, and who worked at Carl's shop 2 days a week as part of a practical training arrangement that the college had agreed to formalize. Brandon was capable and interested, and Carl was teaching him with the same systematic approach his own father had used, explaining the diagnostic logic behind each procedure rather than just the procedure itself. Carl believed a mechanic who understood why a system failed was more valuable than one who knew how to replace a part, and he taught accordingly. Brandon was going to be a good technician. Carl thought that was worth something independent of the shop's business considerations. In November 2024, Carl reviewed the year's service operation accounts the way he reviewed his farming accounts every fall. The shop had generated net revenue of $42,000 in 2024 after parts costs, Brandon's wages, and equipment operating costs. It was not a business that would replace farming. It was not designed to. It was an operation that served a genuine market need, that had expanded the Massey Ferguson brand's practical reach in Finney County, that had provided Carl with a productive use of the skills he had spent 30 years developing, and that had demonstrated something to Garrett Holloway that Garrett had not believed was possible. Garrett had said there was no service infrastructure to support Massey Ferguson operations in this part of Kansas. Carl had built the infrastructure. He had built it with his own certification and his own tools and his own 2 decades of accumulated mechanical knowledge, and he had charged farmers half what the distant dealer charged, and the farmers had responded by bringing him their machines and recommending him to their neighbors, and in 2 cases switching brands specifically because he existed. Garrett had been right that the infrastructure was not there. He had been wrong that it could not be built. That was the distinction Carl thought about occasionally, not with satisfaction exactly, but with the particular clarity that comes from having acted correctly on an accurate assessment of a situation. The infrastructure could be built, so Carl had built it. That was all there was to it. He went into the shop on the first Monday of December to do a scheduled service on Terry's 6S155, which had become one of his regular accounts. The morning was cold. He had the shop heated and the lights on by 7. Brandon arrived at 8, and Carl put him on an oil and filter change on a neighboring farmer's 7S210, while Carl handled the more complex diagnostic work on Terry's machine. They worked through the morning without talking much, because the work required attention, and they both understood that. By noon, they had completed both jobs, and Carl sent Brandon home and cleaned the shop and locked it. He drove to the house and made lunch and looked at his farm records for the afternoon. The planting plans for 2025 were taking shape. He had decisions to make about seed varieties and fertilizer rates and the timing of his winter wheat applications. He had the Massey Ferguson machines to consider in his field planning the way he had always considered his equipment in field planning, as the central practical resource around which every other decision was organized. The machines were good. The shop was running. The farm was producing. Carl Brennan had spent 30 years building his operation with John Deere equipment, and one warranty decision had ended that chapter and opened another. He had built the new chapter the same way he had built the first one. With work and with the refusal to accept someone else's assessment of what was possible as the final word on the subject, Garrett had told the county there was no service infrastructure for Massey Ferguson in Finney County. Carl had made that statement incorrect. It had taken him one winter to do it. Some things were simpler than they appeared when you decided to stop accepting the stated constraints and started looking at what you actually had available to work with.